Hey everyone, Evan Dammer, Locked On Cavs. On today's show, my partner in crime, Chris Manning, and I talk about some hypothetical Lauri Markkanen trades and kind of get a little nuanced with it too. We talk about whether or not it's even viable for the Cavs to trade him and so much more. But before you check it out, thank you for making Locked On Cavs your first listen every day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcasts. And if you're listening to us on YouTube right now, chances are you probably aren't subscribed. So be sure to hit that subscribe button down below and hit the bell so you know when every episode of Locked On Cavs hits your feed.
I'm Chris Manning, covering the Cavs for places like Diamond Up Rocks and SB Nation Fear the Sword. That man on the other side of this YouTube video, or the other voice you'll hear on this podcast if you're in audio form, is Evan Damrell from Facebook's Right Down Euclid. What's up, buddy?
Not a whole lot, man. It has been an interesting evening. I had a splitting migraine before that massive storm came through. You were in the dark ages for a little bit because of it, but I'm glad we're doing okay. Hope everyone else is doing okay. Hopefully you weren't impacted by the hail or the flooding and whatnot, but I'm okay. How are you?
Doing good. We're continuing to just talk through some stuff here and talk about the Cavs offseason. And Evan, this episode, I think the original plan to pull the curtain back was going to be centered around Lauri Markkanen and fake trades. And we were talking about this. And guess what?
Yeah.
That's really kind of hard and not particularly fun or useful for us to do.
It's really hard. I was running some errands at Costco when you first texted me some of the players you were thinking about, and I was thinking about the same players. I'm just like, yeah, I'm kind of drawing a fat blank outside of like these 2 or 3 people we mentioned. And that's not enough to fill 30 minutes of content for the fine folks listening.
Right. So we're watching. So here is what I'm going to throw out there. In thinking about last year's Cavs and thinking about where this is going and all of that fun stuff, I'm going to ask, are the Cavs the basketball team version of a knuckleball? In the sense that, like, they are weird. They are something you don't see every day. That part of their success is baked into their weirdness, baked into their uniqueness, based on the fact that what they're doing comes to you at a different pace. It comes to you from different angles. Knuckleball is maybe not like the perfect comparison because I don't think that they reinvented the wheel so much that it's really like throwing this completely different look at you all the time. But like they play 3 bigs, they play this, they rely on their bigs to switch. Like they kind of like everything is a little bit of a different flavor than you kind of stereotypically get around the league. And I asked that in sense of like, okay, can you look at that and say this is the baseline of what this group as it exists can achieve, and then we're going to build on that success, and that's going to be part of our identity? Or do you look at that as a 1-year thing and say, okay, this is just something that gets us started. Now we have to pivot and figure out where this is actually going. Is it in the middle? What do you think of this like weird analogy I've come up with?
I don't think it's weird necessarily. I think it's an apt comparison. Like you said, weird, unconventional, unique is definitely a good way to put how the Cavs played this year, especially just with the fact that they deployed 3 7-footers at the 3, 4, and 5. And, naturally, that's more of your 5, sometimes your 4. But having 3 of those players like that is definitely an abstract concept. And the Cavs have really made it like their bread and butter and their identity. And you and I have kind of like dabbled on this subject a little bit throughout the week this week with like what's Lauri Markkanen's like long-term future and outlook with this team. Is he permanently penciled in as a starting 3, or is he better used akin to Kevin Love as like the hyper aggressive scoring forward off the bench with just less playmaking and maybe less physicality and rebounding, but with much better shooting in theory at least and more size? But I think this is a copycat league. Obviously, I think you look at some teams that we're in the conference finals, especially Boston and Miami, with teams who like to play through their bigs, who play a little bit bigger to their size. They play physically, defensively, and they, at least in Boston's case, have better shooting overall. But I think the Cavs can take notes from that. I know I talked to JB Bickerstaff about this back when Larry Nance Jr. was still on the roster and was considered kind of like a key piece as well, and ditto for Kevin Love, where like the Cavs took some unique circumstances and made the most of it and found their identity along the way, but it doesn't necessarily mean they can't pivot again. So we'll talk about some hypothetical trades, of course, maybe some players that you could realistically see them trading Lauri Markkanen for, but let's say they get like an actual starting caliber 3 in this rotation and Lauri Markkanen is still on the roster. I don't think the fact that Lauri Markkanen starting at 3 found success for Cleveland should be completely what they're set in stone as. They should adapt, react, and try and see what is the best starting five? What is the best set of personnel to maximize the potential of not just Darius Garland, Evan Mobley, and Jared Allen, but this team overall? Because there's an expectation heading in next season, even if Kobe Altman doesn't want to say there is. They need to be a playoff caliber team right out the gates. And they're not really going to surprise anyone because we talked about this as well. A lot of teams have footage on them playing big now too. And I think it's not going to catch as many people by surprise. So maybe they need to shake things up a little bit. Maybe they need to not go back to formula, but adapt, react, and just kind of build something new.
Yeah, I tend to think that the answer to this is that you have some weirdness and uniqueness and some interesting functionality built in with Evan Mobley and Darius Garland, Jared Allen as your big three. Like if those are your three defining players, those are going to be
being the biggest like X factor of that bunch. He could his trajectory really charts the course for where the Cavs are headed.
Yeah, and like even Garland, I would like Allen is sort of like the square peg going in the square hole. Like he is very much like does what he does it really well and did improve last year, but like kind of what he is. Garland even has like some stuff to him that I want to see where it goes. I want to see how like maybe he gets pushed more off ball as a guy coming off screens and you do more unique stuff with him just to lessen his burden. What would that sort of stylistic change lead to? There are more than one way to think to approach this. I think makes this sort of like a complicated question. I think what I look at though is just saying I think two kind of things, and I think they go hand in hand. Number one, I think that you you have these guys that are built in as your sort of lead figures. Secondly, I also think you have to assume that like what worked this year and the talent you have is probably not good enough just to justify running it back in this knuckleball as it exists right now being your identity. There's obviously going to be some forced evolution from a financial standpoint that is going to come. Like Kevin Love at some point will obviously, not factor into this just because it's based on his age. What happens with Colin Sexton will be interesting. What happens with Karis LeVert long term, it factors into this as well. What they do in the draft this year, right? And how Mobley develops is the biggest one of all. But I think you have to assume that like last year is what accelerated you, and then what is that base? Is there an actual baseline? Is there an actual like what do we believe the actual foundation is here, and how does that inform our decisions? Is how I think about it if I'm the Cavs.
Yeah.
Like I just assume like it's like you have Garland, Mobley, and Allen, and then everything else I think is like this could have been a 1 year weirdo thing. Like Lauri Markkanen as a three is maybe like a 1 year weirdo thing, or do you talk yourself into it being something more? And I think how you answer that question is interesting if you're the team.
It is an interesting thought exercise because you could always say that a smaller backcourt's a one year weirdo thing, just especially because the Cavs found success without Colin Sexton. Maybe they want to put a bigger guard next to Darius Garland just to maybe mitigate some of the defensive and offensive pressure he faces. But it's certainly interesting because one of JB Bickerstaff's biggest flaws, at least one of my biggest red flags in the Cavs are doing their initial coaching searches, is he's a creature of habit. He will lean on what he knows, what he trusts, and he's willing to try new and unconventional things. And I think the Cavs giving him organizationally that runway to kind of experiment, see what works, what doesn't work. And let's be frank, if Lauri Markkanen starting at the three didn't work properly, I'm pretty sure JP would have pulled the plug on the experiment and then started Isaac Okoro, and you'd see Garland, Sexton, Okoro, Mobley, Allen out there or some variation of the sort as well. But I think just, again, financially is the biggest thing for me. I just look at it from that aspect where the Cavs aren't hard capped, obviously, because they can make some moves, but it depends on what they do with Colin Sexton, et cetera, like Karis LeVert's extension eligible. Kevin Love technically is too, but there's definitely paths the Cavs can explore financially to kind of maybe like tie them down long term. But maybe you use this marketing contract, and like I keep saying, you need to break a few of these eggs that you've accumulated during this rebuild or renaissance to maybe consolidate some of this roster space, and you have a cleaner vision of what you're working with going forward. And that's what we'll probably talk about in the next segment, maybe segment 3 as well, is like just maybe some passive Lauri Markkanen, because other than like maybe Isaac Okoro, because I understand people's reservations with Colin Sexton, I think he will stick with the Cavaliers. But other than Isaac Okoro, like Markkanen is like one of the most intriguing obtainable trade assets for the Cavs, like just heading into this kind of market this year. Because like Karis LeVert, that's a contract, but the team could be sold on his upside. But like Markkanen will always have that just intrigue with him because he's 7 feet and he can shoot. Like he's like the prototypical like what you need in a big man. But yes, he has his lumps and flaws. But a team could sell themselves on the idea of maybe ironing out those lumps and finding a way to make him work. And that could be the Cleveland's benefit, but we'll probably talk about that later. I don't know. It's a thought exercise I've been ever since we like kind of were pitching ideas earlier in the week for what we were going to talk about for Lauri Markkanen week, like figuring out a path for him if the Cavs were to trade him has always been an interesting thought exercise because there is the intrigue, but also we have 5 years of tape at this point on him. We kind of have a clear idea of who he is as a player too.
Yeah, and it's like if you're the Cavs, I think you could also look at him as a 3 and say like there's something to this that we think works, and like we're not gonna like move off of that just for the sake of moving off. And I think that's an understandable.
Oh, no, I agree. You don't want to. You don't want to overreact
Yeah.
to your situation either. Like you have something that clearly worked here. You don't have to overreact. But if something did come along, it'd be remiss of you not to consider it.
Yes. All right.
Hey guys, Evan here. We got to pay those bills, so we got to give you a quick word from today's sponsors, starting with today's first sponsor, PrizePicks. All right, NBA fans, are you looking for a daily fantasy option for the NBA? Then you need to try the award-winning PrizePicks app. PrizePicks is daily fantasy made easy. I love it, and I know that you the listener, will love it too. It's pretty easy. You pick 2 to 5 players, the over-under on their projections, and you can win up to 10 times on any entry. It's just you versus the projected numbers. Entries can be made in 60 seconds or less. It's that easy and safe, and they offer fast withdrawals. If you want to check it out, use the award-winning app on both the App Store and the Google Play Store. PrizePicks also allows mixed sports entries, including the NBA, the MLB, NHL, NFL, NCAA, you name it. Users anywhere can take the over on player one, such as LeBron James, and the under on Anthony Davis in the same entry and do pretty well for themselves. So, for a limited time, PrizePicks is an exclusive, no-brainer of an offer for all of our users. Users get $50 for free if a player in your first PrizePicks entry scores a single point, but you must use code NBA. That's right. This is an exclusive offer available to Locked On Cavs fans. Sign up today and use code NBA, like the league, for $50 for free if a player in your first PrizePicks entry scores a single point. Before we head back to today's episode of Locked On Cavs, check out the Ultimate NBA Mock Draft, which starts June 16th. It features over 50 insiders, including Chris Manning and myself, and nothing equals the Ultimate NBA Mock Draft by comparison. Locked On NBA Big Board Draft experts, plus the Odyssey insiders. It's just the perfect storm of NBA draft madness and goodness. First picks is June 16th, like I said. Search Ultimate NBA Mock Draft and follow now so you won't miss a single pick.
But back to trading. So, love you too. But also, folks, Chris is turning the big 79 this year, so get us to 2,000 subs before then, or else he'll have a bad birthday. You don't want to ruin Chris's birthday now, do you?
Please don't. So, Evan, let's look at this roster for a second. So, like, we've said this a bunch. There are the 3 untouchables: Garland, Mobley, and Allen.
Correct.
And then I think you look at everything else, and it's both like guys that you could trade, but also guys that I think are hard to discern what their value is. Like you could tell me
like Kevin Love is the one. He's making $30 million, and that's still really hard to ship to a team.
Yeah, like look, I think his value is like I kind of want to run it back with him when we're just because I kind of like the vibe of that, honestly. Even if there's part of my head that tells me like I don't know if that's going to be exactly the same next year. There's something about what he did that I think feels sustainable for at least another year. But like you look at LeVert, it's like he's at 17.5. You have the contract situation. Like what? It's clear his value wasn't like crazy at the trade deadline. It's like what is it now? What is Eddie Osman's value as an expiring contract, but like a 27-year-old kind of like NBA wing? Like what is that value? What is Markkanen's value? You could get a ton of different answers from tons of different teams depending on who you talk to, and like. There's not like things the Cavs have that like strike me as like very logical sort of moves. And that's why like I do think what we will see in July is like Sexton as the sign and trade thing is a thing I think you will see sort of like maybe not super aggressively, but it just makes sense as a thing that will kind of get explored. It just makes too much sense not for that to happen. But like, what is his value coming off an injury too? Like, this is like none of the stuff that they could do to shake up the roster feels like I even have a good peg on like what the value is to other teams.
It's tricky because, again, like you said, Cedi Osman is hit or miss. I mean, if you want to look at it, his contract is technically expiring. If you just want to just look at this year alone, and then you can easily get him off your books the following season. I think a team could have intrigue in him if they want to buy low on like a cheaper wing that can give you some shooting.
Him and like a second feels like I would want. That would be the package that if I'm like calling out there and just trying to buy low on something, that's probably the package I'm calling out on.
So if you're saying define by low, like how low would you go for that?
If there's like if there is, well, you have to get in a certain salary range. But so Cedi Osman is making. So like if there's like a player like if you could find a team that wants to maybe move on from a guy who has a year or two more left on the contract, they want to save money for the next summer. They have a player in that range that like fits you a little bit. So like here's an example. So Kentavious Caldwell-Pope he will be an expiring contract next year. So this isn't like a perfect thing, but it's like he's making a little more than Cedi. Would they say like, hey, we'll take Cedi in a second for KCP and the Cavs get an upgrade on the wing in KCP? Like, is there a player like that in that sort of range that you could look at and say like, okay, we could get this guy. We'll trade Cedi and give a team salary relief in a second in exchange for that. Like, I mean, like, you know, Memphis has a very loaded roster.
Well, let me ask
would
you
they
this.
Want to shade Anthony Melton?
If you were the Wizards, would you trade Kentavious Caldwell-Pope for Cedi Osman?
I don't know what the Wizards are doing. You could, because
KCP is an interesting player, and Jake Fisher also listed the Wizards as a team that is gauging Colin Sexton's market as well. So like that they could be somebody you could get a little freaky with it too if you wanted to maybe make it expand upon that sign and trade. Like there are avenues, but keep going. Go ahead. Sorry.
So it's
the Grizzlies are the team I go back to where I'm like, you might be able to pull a piece or two off them.
Well, so is it like here's like in scanning the salary list, here are like the names that kind of pop up in the salary range, and I have different reactions to a lot of these. First we have D'Anthony Melton, who I would think would be very good.
Oh yeah,
he play a lot of minutes. 8 million next year, 8.2 next year, 8 year the after. It's sort of a salary wash in terms of like one for one, but like he has one
client as well, which helps.
He has one more guarantee year. Would Memphis want to save money? Royce O'Neal, you know, not going to be your lockdown defender, but a solid enough NBA wing. 9.2 next year, 9.5 thereafter. Would Utah want to shed some money and reset there? You know, you look at like Monty Morris is like, does Denver need to shed some money with the Jokic situation? Like he could be like your actual answer backup point guard. Like these are the kind of things in that range you're kind of, I think, looking. It's like, is there a marginal upgrade at a position of need for us that we could turn Cedi's money into? But like, again, this is like the sexiest fake trade I can come up with. And I'm not good at this. I'll readily admit I'm bad at fake trades, but this is like the where my brain sort of goes with some of this stuff.
No, I agree. I raised my eyebrows at the Denver trade you proposed just because I'm like, yeah, the Jokic extension definitely will factor in. I know like they probably want to offload Aaron Gordon's salary as well if they really wanted to like get rid of some bigger money just to kind of make things a little more palatable when they sign Nikola Jokic to that Supermax extension.
I got a fun one. I'm going to see if I can make it work, but continue.
Okay. And the Grizzlies, like I said, are a team I circle back to where maybe you could pry like a player or two because like they have their core guys that have made them successful, but I think just that's the cost of being a team who rebuilds primarily through the draft, and you know smart trades as well help quite a bit. But like they built a lot of their core through the draft, and now they have to pay the pauper his fee, and like that's just kind of the benefit here. And that's like the duality of being a small market team and also becoming good really quickly is you have to pay these players sooner instead of later, but. That's definitely something worth watching. The Cedi contract is interesting too. Maybe like a team like Oklahoma City be willing to take a stab on him too, just because like he could be decent-ish for them. But Memphis is a team I keep circling back to. You have to look at teams that are maybe going to be a little more strapped for cash financially, maybe a little bit more frugal as well. Maybe Orlando would be interested in like offloading Markelle Fultz if you package Jetty's
Ugh.
contract with a second. Okay, Markelle Fultz is the backup
just-
point guard to
Yeah,
Darius Garland. Makes a lot of sense, and yes, he's injury prone, but he would fit schematically a player JB Bickerstaff likes as well as like a tough nosed defensive guard too.
So this one, the one that I found that I'm now gonna like think about, doesn't totally work one for one, and I don't. And
Oh,
like
we're gonna talk about Lauri Markkanen trades too, and here we are deep diving Jetty Osman trades for 10 minutes.
This is just like the where my brain went. It's just the ones that seem more plausible. Jetty Osman, you can't do this straight up, so you'd have to include like a Dylan Windler as like a 1 year.
Oh, God forbid.
Well, but like in terms of like he'd have to like the salary gets it doesn't save this other team as much money, but it saves them like $3 million on the cap. Luke Kennard, he's got 3 years left on his contract.
It's a player the Cavs have been interested in, and I know Tyler Blue like
maybe depends what he thinks of him, but it's like Jetty plus Dylan Windler is like 11 million that could come off the cap for the Clippers the year after if they want to cut a little money in the edges and like do something else with that and like gives them a trade chip into something like I think Kennard would help the Cavs. Like that's the kind of thing I'm poking around at, and that's like not sexy, but like that's the kind of jiggering I think I'm gonna do. Well, let's do market and trades, Evan, after the break. How do you feel about Kennard?
I like Luke Kennard. I like what he provides. I like in theory what he gives you. I think I know he's a player the Cavs kind of were sniffing around a little bit on just when the Clippers were kind of in that weird space where Paul George might be out for the year, and then Kawhi Leonard was obviously out for the year, and maybe like they kind of scale it back and start like just focusing on next season, and they kind of offload some salary just to get themselves below the tax. But it just depends. The Clippers are a really well-run organization, and I wonder if Jerry West and company are willing to play ball and maybe give up a player who kind of carved out a meaningful spot in the rotation for the Clippers and maximizing the opportunity in front of him with the lack of stars in front of him.
Yes. All right. After the break, we'll do some market and trades, and maybe we'll talk about we'll do 5 minutes on market and trades, including one I
have one team I want to talk about before we do market and trades, but we'll save it after the breaks. You mentioned them, and I had to piece my thoughts together on that.
Right. So we'll get to that, and we'll get to market and trades after the break. But first,
hey guys, Evan here one last time with some more bills to pay, and today's other sponsor is BetOnline. BetOnline.net is your number one source for all your betting stats and sports info. Find all the latest sports developments, news, and odds, including this year's NBA championship, the NHL Stanley Cup Finals, Major League Baseball, and of course, all the latest fighting news from MMA to UFC to boxing and more. BetOnline is your continued source for all your sports wagering information, including live betting, esports, and anything you can really think of. So, if you're interested, head to the website today and use your mobile device to learn more about the trends in action. BetOnline, where the game starts. And before we head back in, thank you again for making Locked On Cavs your first listen every day. Make sure to go check out the Locked On NBA Big Board. Host Rafael Barlow from NBA Draft Junkies and the author of the NBA Big Board newsletter is joined by Richard Saman, Sam Ferris, and Leif Thulin, giving fans an in-depth look at the NBA Draft with mock drafts, player rankings, and of course, big boards. It's free and available wherever you get your podcasts. Probably the same place you're listening right now for Locked On Cavs.
Evan, tell me where you wanted to go here?
So you mentioned the Utah Jazz, and they're an interesting trade team because Mac Robinson, our editor in editorialism, I don't know what he is at this point.
He's our
producer. Our producer. That's the title. My brain's a little cooked this week. Let me say that the long weekend and then another long weekend ahead of me, just back to back, and June in general, wedding season, baby. But he floated the idea of the Cavs trying to get Mike Conley from the Jazz, and he mentioned that you weren't a fan of that. I heard you gag, but
I talked to him about it at the radio, and I explicitly I broke it down in every single way possible. And then I'll probably Mac's going to be on the show. You're going to be off on Thursday. Mac's going to come in, and we'll talk about Mike Conley, and I'll just dunk on that for 20 minutes.
Well, I know JB Bickerstaff's a proponent of trying to get Mike Conley, but I said this to Mac. The Jazz want to be competitive next year, not just because they have Donovan Mitchell and Rudy Gobert. As much as I like to make fun of Rudy Gobert, myself included, he is a very good player for what he does for the Jazz. They want to be competitive not only because they have those two, but also because they're hosting the All-Star game next year. And I think there is a little bit of an onus to be a semi-competitive team when you're hosting one of the biggest events, if not the biggest event in the NBA, other than the NBA Finals. And then you maybe move forward from there. And if it doesn't work, you start stripping it down and you start offloading salary then. And I told Mac, like, hey, if the Cavs sign Ricky Rubio and let's say they get like Raul Neto or something, like that's who they roll with is like their guard depth chart heading into next season. And obviously Neto is just a bit of a placeholder till Rubio come back. And if Rubio is not the player he is, this is what I said to Max. I just didn't think of it at the time. Maybe you explore trading for Mike Conley at that point, but at the same time, you have to see where the Jazz are at as well. Like, are they still semi-competent? Are they still trying to like tread water a little bit in the Western Conference? And if they're like just bad, maybe you try and price some assets for them. So the Jazz, our team might put a pin in and maybe consider like down the line closer to the trade deadline. Because let's say the Karis LeVert experiment in Cleveland doesn't work out. That's a pretty big expiring contract you have. You could use to go get a better role player for you on your team. But it's just a different situation in general, and I just think this is a Cavs team who isn't quick to react or overreact, I should say, necessarily. And the Jazz also just are a team they have a good history with trade-wise. Like Kobe Altman has a good working relationship with what the Jazz have, like the Kyle Korver trade, the Jordan Clarkson trade. Eventually Donovan Mitchell will be in Cleveland because every shooting guard that has played for the Jazz ended up playing for the Cavs.
Yeah, he's probably going to go to the Knicks, but yeah.
Or
he's going to the Heat.
He's probably not the Heat. It's interesting because Jake Fisher said the Heat like don't want to play ball, but like because Max like it doesn't seem like the Heat want to do this. Like no, I just don't think the Jazz want to do it because they want to be competitive, but they're not ready to face the reality of their situation. But that's just where I'm at with the Jazz. I think they're an interesting trade partner. I think the Cavs having a good history with them definitely gives them favor in like negotiations, but also I think maybe more so they're a team you put a pin in, and let's say like they're just middling and just average by the time the trade deadline's looming, maybe then you try and say like, hey, Mike Conley, what you up to? You want to move back to Ohio? You can be from Columbus, Ohio, like Karis LeVert, but then people will do the hang on sleepy shit with you every time there's a timeout. But yeah, just put a pin in that for now. But let's talk about some Lauri Markkanen trades because this is more so what I mentioned in a subscriber exclusive for Write Down Euclid. If the Cavs wanted to go big name hunting and also sign Colin Sexton, you're gonna have to use Lauri Markkanen's contract to maybe go do that.
So there's a lot of different ways you could go with this. I think the two things I've thought about as money options for Markkanen would be Harrison Barnes in Sacramento or Gordon Hayward in Charlotte. Both guys a little different, Barnes on expiring, and the money's more even. You'd have to do like Osman plus Markkanen to get within the range of Hayward. He's got the injury issues. Like there's some concerns with both of these, and like are they available? What is sort of the reality here? But those are like the kind of like upgrades I'd sort of be looking at. They provide different things, again, different financial considerations with those as well. But like those are the kind of salaries I think I'm trying to like trade up for if I'm using that trade. And again, that takes two teams to tango. Like you could dream differently. Like Andrew Wiggins is in the last year of his contract, and like the Warriors are paying lots of money, but like he's proven to be pretty useful for them. Like you could poke around a lot of different names with this. It's just like I've come on to Barnes at 18 next year and Hayward at 30 next year as like the two guys I've kind of been like thinking about in this and 31 and a half year after.
Another name for you?
Hit me.
Gary Trent Jr.
Markkanen does not strike me as a Toronto Raptors type guy.
What if you included Isaac Okoro's contract with it?
I just don't know.
You give up defensive upside for that offensive punch, and just like again, talk to Mac about this. But like ideally, you want Colin Sexton to have Gary Trent Jr.'s shot chart. But if you're able just to have both, it's the spoils go to the riches, and whatever the hell that saying goes, I don't fucking know. I'm not a wordsmith.
I mean,
technically I am, but I'm just
Gary Trent Jr. 17.5 next year, 18.7 player option the year after. That trade, he intrigues me as like an option you could look at. I think I just like
What
look at
if you
that and
did like
wonder.
a Coro and Osman and not this year's first, but maybe a future first?
Let's see if that works. I Markkanen in that context, just like Lauri Markkanen does not scream like Toronto Raptors player to me.
Yeah, that's a fair assessment, I'd say too.
Like I could see like other teams like talking. Like I could see like the Kings being like, okay, we need the shooting, blah blah blah.
Let's get that Euro big we've always wanted.
Yeah, you could see like Charlotte being like, okay, let's just recoup, let's just kind of move on from Hayward and like try to reset a little bit and still have like a theoretically tradable contract. I look at Toronto as like kind of what they're building, and it's just like, does this fit them? Like I don't know. I wonder if there's maybe San Antonio has had some rumored interest in Sexton. Like, is there like what would the price
San
be?
Antonio has had interest in Lauri Markkanen too.
Yeah, that was, and so like, is there business to be done like there maybe? Like, so if you did, what was the Gary Trent Jr.? You said
Okoro and Osman in a second if you really need to grease Toronto's palms on this one.
So if you do that math wise,
not a second at first, sorry.
So Osman plus Okoro for Trent does work. You are basically, I would assume you're getting him on an expiring, which I would wonder how much you want to grease the wheels on Gary Trent if you're maybe only getting him for a rental. That's kind of an interesting proposition. That's the other part of this that I think is really interesting, is that they have team years of marketing control that I probably has some value to them. And are you willing to sacrifice next year, basically 3 years? And there's the partial guarantee in the last year, but like you have multiple years where you kind of know you have him. Are you willing to sacrifice that in a market where cap space and flexibility has never exactly proven to be your best friend? That's an interesting question to me that I think I would assume that team control has some answer. Like, it's like with the Colin Sexton thing. They're not just gonna like let that hit. Like if he goes somewhere else, I would bet my bottom dollar that they're probably gonna extract something out of that, because they can't just let him walk for nothing. They're not in a position, I think, to necessarily like do a trade. It doesn't feel to me like they would maybe do. They're in a spot right now to do a trade where they're not at least forward thinking a little bit, and then and what that would do to negotiations would be kind of an interesting question to me, I guess, in terms of like a Gary Trent Jr. type or a Harrison Barnes type, frankly, because
Harrison Barnes makes a lot of sense for this Cavs team, just because he ideally fits more so what JV Bickerstaff probably wants from a three who plays defense, provides play. He's like a connector piece more so we talked about. And
yeah.
The shooting upside of Markkanen isn't there with Barnes, obviously, but the other factors he brings to the table kind of counterbalance that loss a little bit. Well, and then like, hopefully do you want to resign more shooting in free agency or in different avenues, whether it's the draft, free agency, things like that. Maybe like your quote unquote move this year is to do something. But let's also, for reference, you can, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but the Cavs, the last, I want to say 2-3 off seasons, have made some type of trade to upgrade their roster in some tangible way. I know the JaVale McGee one is one we always talk about as like a Kobe Altman special. I think the Lauri Markkanen sign traded Larry Nance Jr. was a good example of this. So the last 2 seasons are what I'm thinking of. I think maybe it's probably going to have, or the Ricky Rubio trade as well. Like the Cavs are a team who are aggressive, and I think they are cognizant of the fact that they are a non-glamour market in terms of free agency, so they might strike out in that regard. So if they get dudes who are under contract this year or for this year and next year, it only helps them long term. And I think using some of the pieces they've assembled makes that a lot easier.
I want to see how the Cavs end up approaching the summer, and what we find out about that as this goes, I think will be fascinating. Evan,
yeah.
You're about to dip out for a couple of days. Do you have any final thoughts on this before we'll do a lot of draft stuff in the next couple weeks. So this maybe we'll put a pin in some of this free agency and trade stuff until closer to the draft. Maybe we'll see if more information comes out. But is there anything final thoughts on this before you take a couple of days off here?
I'll be back Monday or possibly Monday, depending on how cooked I am Sunday. But I'm going to go see my best friend get married on Saturday. It'll be a fun time. Going to Nashville, which is always fun. It's going to be hotter than hell down there. So send your thoughts and prayers to me as a large Midwest man with heavy shoulders, sweating his nads off in that heat and humidity. And enjoy Chris and Mac Robinson, and also Robert Ory will be on the show, not with us, but he will be on the show for Friday.
Yeah, we'll be running a segment from Locked On Sports today where Peter Bukowski interviewed Robert Horry. It's a really cool segment, so you guys get to check that out and check out that podcast if you haven't already. Megan Mac will come through. We're going to just talk about Mike Conley. I think Mac and I should just have a Mike Conley discussion because that feels like something that
Chris is ready to scrap. It's like he smells the blood in the water. And Mac is the unassuming diver in the cage who does not know what I did before I sped off in the boat.
Well, the thing is that it's like I'm a longtime Mike Conley appreciator. It's just like in this specific context, I'm just like, I don't know if this makes sense.
Existing in this economy is hard enough to ask for me, but paying Mike Conley in this economy too is also a big ask for me too.
Paying for gas and paying for Mike Conley, what a world that would be. Oh man, it's a lot going on here. But if you want a great second listen today, go check out the Locked On NBA Big Board Show. Host Rafael Barlow from NBA Draft Junkies and author of the NBA Big Board newsletter. By the way, he has the Cavs picking Johnny Davis in his latest mock. Go subscribe. Is joined by Richard Stamen, Sam Ferris, and Lee Fluine, giving fans an in-depth look into the NBA draft, mock draft, player rankings, and of course, their big boards. It's free and available wherever you get your podcasts. Again, tomorrow, Mac Robinson. Evan, what are you chuckling over there?
Josh Allen has Tom Brady's combine photo on it from the match. It just made me chuckle.
Patrick Mahomes hit a driver off the ground. Basically, that was 300 yards, and I got very mad about how good he is at sports. It's like just incredible stuff from that man.
Well, then remember who his brother and soon-to-be wife are, and it kind of balances out really quick for you.
Brady roasting him about TikTok, or Aaron Rodgers roasting him about TikTok was a beautiful. The only social content I've seen is that, and I'm good with that. All right, back to Mac Robinson tomorrow. We're going to talk about Mike Conley. Until then, be well.